The throne room was still ringing with the echo of Lord Theron's voice when Gabriella realized she'd stopped breathing. Not because she was afraid. She'd spent 3 years being afraid of that voice, flinching at the sharp edges of it in hallways and behind closed doors. No, she'd stopped breathing because of what happened next. Because the Alpha King of the Eastern Dominion, the most powerful man on the continent, the male who had taken her hand in front of 600 witnesses not 3 hours ago, did not flinch, did not blink, did not even shift his weight on the obsidian throne. He simply looked at Lord Theron the way a wolf looks at something too small to be worth killing, and then he smiled. But that moment, that single devastating smile that would rewrite the rest of Gabriella's life, hadn't happened yet. To understand it, to feel the full weight of what it meant, she had to go back. Back to the night everything changed. Back to the rain. It had been 11 days earlier when Gabriella first saw Julius Ashworth, though she hadn't known his name then. Hadn't known anything about him except that he was tall, drenched, and standing in the doorway of her shop like the storm had personally delivered him. She'd been closing up. The Hollow Market district emptied early when the autumn rains came, and her little apothecary was no exception. The last customer had left an hour ago, and Gabriella had been wiping down her work table, her fingers stained with the deep indigo of moonpetal extract, when the door had opened without so much as a knock. She'd reached for the iron pestle beneath the counter before she'd even turned around. "We're closed," she said, her voice flat and steady in the way she'd perfected over years of being a woman alone in a city that didn't care about women alone. The stranger didn't leave. He stood there, water pooling beneath his boots on her clean floor, and she could feel him looking at her even before she turned. The weight of his gaze was a physical thing, heavy and warm despite the cold pouring through the open door behind him. When she finally turned, she almost dropped the pestle. He was not what she expected. She'd expected a drunk, maybe, or one of the dock workers who sometimes wandered too far uphill looking for trouble. What she got was something else entirely. A man built like a siege wall, broad across the shoulders and chest, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and eyes the color of aged whiskey, amber shot through with gold. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, bisecting it cleanly, and his jaw was sharp enough to cut glass. But it was his eyes that held her. Not their color, though that was arresting enough. It was the way they locked onto hers and stayed, as if he'd been looking for something and had just found it in the space between her heartbeats. Something tugged in Gabriella's chest, low and insistent, like a thread being pulled taut. She ignored it. She was good at ignoring things. "I said we're closed." "I heard you." His voice was low, rough at the edges, the kind of voice that vibrated in the air between them. He took one step forward, then stopped, as if he'd caught himself. His eyes dropped to the pestle in her hand and the corner of his mouth twitched. "I need a healer." "I'm an apothecary. There's a healer 2 streets down." "The healer 2 streets down is dead drunk and snoring in his own doorway." "I checked." He shifted, and she saw it then. The way his left arm hung slightly wrong, the dark stain spreading beneath his cloak that she'd mistaken for rain. Blood. Her healer's instincts overrode her survival ones before she could stop them. She was already moving toward him, the pestle forgotten on the counter, her eyes cataloging what she could see. The wound was high on his left side, partially hidden by the heavy traveling cloak. His breathing was controlled but shallow. He was holding himself very, very still, and she recognized that stillness. It was the kind that came from refusing to let pain win. "Sit down," she said, and it wasn't a request. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, that she'd given him an order. But he sat. He lowered himself onto the stool by the window with a control that told her he was either extremely disciplined or extremely practiced at being hurt. Neither option was comforting. She lit 2 more lamps and gathered her supplies, moving with the efficiency that came from years of practice. Clean linen, willow bark tincture, the salve she made from starglow moss and honey, the one that cost more than most people in this district made in a month. "Take off the cloak." He unfastened the clasp one-handed and let it fall. Beneath it, he wore a simple dark tunic, finely made but deliberately plain. The kind of clothing a rich man wore when he didn't want to look rich. She filed that information away. The wound was a clean slash across his ribs, deep enough to need stitching, but not deep enough to have hit anything vital. A blade, not claws. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Who did this to you?" she asked as she cleaned the wound. Her fingers were steady. They were always steady. It was the one thing she could count on about herself. Someone who won't try again. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. He was watching her hands. She could feel his gaze tracking every movement, and when her fingers brushed the skin beside the wound, she felt him tense. Not in pain, in something else. That thread in her chest pulled again, harder this time. She stitched him in silence. He didn't make a sound, not even when she drew the needle through skin that must have been screaming. His breathing stayed even, his hands rested on his thighs, and his eyes never left her face. When she finished, she straightened up and found herself standing much closer to him than she'd intended. Close enough to see the flecks of darker gold in his irises. Close enough to feel the heat radiating off him despite the cold rain still drumming against the windows. "You're good at that," he said quietly. "I should be. I've been doing it long enough." "How long?" She stepped back. Distance. She needed distance. Long enough to know when someone's wound came from a fight they went looking for. That almost smile again, pulling at the edge of his mouth. "And what makes you think I went looking for it?" "Because you walked into my shop instead of going to the garrison. Whatever happened, you don't want anyone official to know about it." She crossed her arms. "Which means either you're running from something or you did something you shouldn't have." He studied her for a long moment. The lamplight caught the amber of his eyes and turned them molten. "Or," he said slowly, "I'm someone who can't afford to be recognized." The words settled between them like stones dropped into still water. She felt the ripples of them spreading outward, touching something in the back of her mind. Some instinct that told her she was standing at the edge of something she couldn't see the bottom of. "Who are you?" she whispered. He held her gaze. "Just a traveler. For now." She should have pushed, should have demanded more, but the hour was late and the rain was heavy and there was something in his eyes, something ancient and weary and honest, that made her let it go. She let him sleep in the back room, told herself it was because he'd lost blood and shouldn't be walking in the rain, told herself it was professional concern, told herself the way her pulse fluttered when he said thank you in that low, rough voice meant nothing at all. She was a very good liar when she needed to be, but only to herself. He was still there in the morning, and the morning after that. He never asked to stay. He simply made himself useful. Fixed the leaking shelf in the storeroom, carried the heavy crates of dried herbs that she usually wrestled with alone, stood quietly in the corner of the shop while she worked, reading from the old texts on her shelf with an ease that told her he was educated far beyond what his plain clothing suggested. On the third morning, she came downstairs to find he'd made tea. Not just any tea. He'd blended the sweetbriar and lemon verbena she kept in separate jars, combined them in the exact proportions she preferred. She knew she'd never told him that. She knew he must have been watching her, learning her habits, and the thought should have unsettled her. Instead, something cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. "You're still here," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Do you want me to leave?" The question was simple. His voice was not. There were layers in it, depths she couldn't quite reach. And she realized with a start that she was afraid of the answer that wanted to come out of her mouth. "I want to know who you are." She met his eyes. "Really?" He set down his own cup. The morning light caught the scar through his eyebrow, and she noticed for the first time how carefully he held himself, always positioned between her and the door, always angled so he could see the windows, like a man who expected attack, like a man who lived with the knowledge of it every day. "If I tell you, he said. Everything changes. You might not want me here anymore. Try me. He exhaled slowly. My name is Julius Ashworth. The cup nearly slipped from her fingers. She knew that name. Everyone in the 5 territories knew that name. Julius Ashworth, the Alpha King of the Eastern Dominion, commander of the Ashworth Pack. The man whose coronation had been the talk of every market and tavern for the past year. The most powerful alpha in 3 generations was sitting in her kitchen, drinking tea from her chipped cups. She couldn't finish the sentence. Yes. The Alpha King. Yes. She stared at him. He stared back. And in his eyes, she saw it clearly. Fear. Not of her, but of what she would do now. Of whether she would look at him differently, pull away, become the rigid formality that everyone else gave him like armor he'd never asked to wear. Your Majesty, She started to rise, to bow, to do something proper and expected. Don't. The word came out raw. He reached across the table, his fingers hovering just above her wrist, not touching, asking permission with the space between their skin. Please, don't. She sank back down. Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. And Alpha's hearing was sharp enough to catch a whisper through stone walls. He could definitely hear the wild percussion of her pulse. Why are you here? She asked. Why my shop? Why this district? Because I was tracking a threat to my people and the trail led here. Because I got careless and took a blade I should have dodged. And because... He paused. His jaw worked. Because the moment I walked through that door and you looked at me, I felt something I haven't felt in my entire life. The thread in her chest sang. She pulled her hand back. Not because she didn't feel it. Because she did. Because she felt it so strongly it terrified her, and Gabriella did not do well with terror. She buried it, packed it down deep where it couldn't reach her. I can't, she said. Whatever you think this is, you're wrong. Am I? I'm nobody. I'm an apothecary in the worst district of a city that your kind barely acknowledges exists. I have nothing. I am nothing that would matter to a king. Something shifted in his expression. The warmth didn't leave, but it hardened into something fierce. Who told you that? He asked, and his voice had dropped into a register that made the hair on her arm stand up. Not because it was threatening, because it was protective. Protectiveness like a wall being built around her with nothing but sound. Who made you believe you were nothing? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. He read it in her silence the way he seemed to read everything about her, in the spaces between her words, in the things she didn't say. Gabriella. Her name in his mouth was a revelation. He spoke it like it mattered. Like it was the only word in any language worth saying. I'm not leaving. You're a king. You can't stay in an apothecary shop. Watch me. He stayed, and the days that followed were the strangest, most terrifying, most beautiful days of her life. He stayed, and he listened when she talked about her work. Asked questions that proved he was actually hearing her answers. He stayed, and she learned that he took his tea without honey, but always left the last sip in the cup. That he read with his head slightly tilted. That when he thought she wasn't looking, he watched her with an expression so tender it made her chest ache. On the 5th night, the threat he'd been tracking found them. 3 men broke through the shop's back door just after midnight. She heard the crash of wood, and was on her feet before she was fully awake, grabbing for the blade she kept beneath her pillow. But Julius was already there, already between her and the door, already shifting, not fully, but enough that the air around him crackled with barely contained power. The fight was short, brutal. She watched him move with a precision that stole her breath, each movement deliberate, devastatingly efficient. He didn't kill them. He could have. She could see it in the restraint that cost him, the way his muscles locked when instinct told him to end it. But he didn't. For her. Because she was watching, and he didn't want her to see that. When it was over, when the three men were bound and unconscious on her shop floor, and the Alpha King's guard finally arrived, summoned by means she didn't understand. Julius turned to her. He was breathing hard. There was a cut on his cheekbone, and his eyes were still burning with that otherworldly gold. "Are you hurt?" His voice was wrecked. "No." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, and his hands came up to frame her face, and the world narrowed to the press of his palms against her skin, warm, calloused, trembling. "I can't lose you," he said, and the words sounded like they'd been ripped from somewhere deep inside him, somewhere he hadn't let anyone reach before. "I just found you. I can't." She kissed him. She didn't decide to. Her body simply moved, rising up on her toes, her hands fisting in the front of his shirt, and her mouth found his with a certainty that bypassed every wall she'd ever built. The kiss was fire and relief and homecoming all at once. And the thread in her chest didn't just sing, it blazed, golden and incandescent, connecting them in a way she felt all the way to her bones. He made a sound against her mouth. Low, desperate, reverent. His arms wrapped around her and pulled her flush against him, and he kissed her back like she was air and he'd been drowning. When they finally broke apart, foreheads pressed together, breathing ragged, she whispered, "I'm scared." "I know." He pressed his lips to her forehead. "I am too. Kings don't get scared. This one does. Of you. Of how much you already mean to me." In the days that followed, things moved quickly. The threat was connected to a faction within the Eastern Dominion's court, nobles who opposed Julius's rule and sought leverage against him. The attack on the apothecary had been a test, a probe to see if the rumors were true, that the Alpha King had found his mate in a nobody healer from the Hollow Market. Julius brought her to the palace, not as a prisoner, not as a guest, but as his intended. She'd fought him on it, of course, fought him with every argument she had. She wasn't noble. She had no family name, no lineage, no wealth. She had scarred hands and a rented shop and a past she wouldn't talk about, and he was a king. He listened to every objection. And then he took her hands, those scarred, capable hands, and pressed his lips to each knuckle. "You are the strongest person I have ever met," he said, "and I would burn my own crown before I let anyone make you feel unworthy of standing beside me." She cried. She hated crying, but she cried, and he held her, and she let herself be held for the first time in longer than she could remember. She told him about Theron on the 7th night. They were in the palace library, the fire burning low, and she was tucked against his side with a book she wasn't reading. "He was a lord's son in the Western province," she said, her voice carefully flat. "I was young. I thought love was supposed to hurt." Julius's arm tightened around her. She felt the tension coil through his entire body, the predator in him going very, very still. He controlled everything. What I wore, who I spoke to, whether I could work. When I finally left, he told everyone I was mad, unstable, that I'd stolen from his family. She swallowed. No one believed me over him. So I ran, ended up in the Hollow Market, built something small and mine. "What's his full name?" Julius's voice was lethally calm. "It doesn't matter. Gabriella. Lord Theron Vial." Something changed in Julius's eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like a piece sliding into place. "Theron Vial sits on my Western Council." Her blood went cold. "What?" "Not for long." She grabbed his arm. "You can't. He'll know it was me, he'll come for me, he will never touch you again." Julius turned to face her fully, and his eyes were blazing. "He will never speak your name again. I swear it on every star in the sky, and every drop of blood in my veins." She believed him. That was the terrifying part. She looked into those amber eyes and she believed him completely. The ceremony was held 6 days later. A formal bonding before the court, witnessed by representatives from all 5 territories. Gabriella wore deep orange silk that Julius himself had chosen, and when she walked into the throne room on legs that threatened to buckle, she found 600 faces staring at her. Most were curious. Some were hostile, but the only face she saw clearly was Julius's, standing beside the obsidian throne, and the look on his face when he saw her made every fear she'd ever carried feel like dust. He looked at her, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. The bonding words were ancient, spoken in the old tongue, and when his hand closed around hers, the golden thread between them snapped into place with a force that made them both gasp. She felt him. Not just his touch, but his heart, his joy, his fierce and overwhelming love, pouring through the bond like sunlight through a window thrown open. It was done. They were bonded. And for approximately 40 seconds, everything was perfect. Then the throne room doors slammed open. Lord Theron Vielle strode in like he owned the marble beneath his boots. He was exactly as Gabriella remembered. Tall, golden-haired, handsome in the way that a blade is handsome, all sharp edges designed to cut. Behind him trailed 3 of his personal guard, and a woman Gabriella didn't recognize, draped in enough jewels to fund the hollow market for a year. "This bonding is illegitimate," Theron's voice rang off the vaulted ceiling. He pointed at Gabriella, and she felt herself shrink before she caught it, before she straightened her spine and refused to be small. "That woman is a thief and a liar. She was banished from the Western Province for crimes against my house." The murmur that swept the room was a living thing. Julius didn't stand. He sat on the obsidian throne, one hand resting on its arm, and watched Theron approach with an expression of such complete and terrifying calm that seasoned warriors in the crowd took a step back. "Lord Vale," Julius said. His voice carried without effort, filling the room the way smoke fills a jar, everywhere at once. "You were not invited. I don't need an invitation to prevent a king from making the worst mistake of his reign." Theron stopped at the base of the throne dais. His eyes found Gabriella, and the look in them was one she knew intimately. Ownership. Fury at having his property taken. "She's nothing. A commoner with delusions. She spent 2 years in my household as little more than—" "Choose your next words very carefully." Julius's voice hadn't changed volume. It didn't need to. The temperature in the room dropped. "You are speaking about my bonded mate, my queen." "Your queen?" Theron laughed, high and disbelieving. "You'll regret choosing her. She is nothing. She was nothing when I found her, and she'll be nothing long after your little infatuation burns out. I had her first, Your Majesty, and I can tell you from personal experience that she is not worth the crown you're placing on her head." The silence that followed was absolute. Gabriella felt the bond between them light up like a signal fire. Julius's rage poured through it, vast and controlled, a storm contained in a glass vessel. But he didn't move. He sat perfectly still, and that stillness was more frightening than any display of force could have been. Then he smiled. It was the most dangerous thing Gabriella had ever seen, a slow, deliberate curve of the mouth that held no warmth whatsoever. "Lord Vale." Julius stood. The movement was unhurried, graceful. The rise of something ancient and powerful unfolding to its full height. He descended the steps of the dais one at a time, each footfall deliberate. "You say you had her first. Let me tell you what that means to me." He stopped one step above Theron, looking down at him with those burning amber eyes. "It means you had the privilege of knowing the most extraordinary woman in these 5 territories, and you were too small, too cruel, and too blind to see what you held." His voice was soft now, intimate, as if he were sharing a secret. The entire throne room strained to hear. "It means you were given a gift beyond your comprehension and you broke it because breaking things is the only power you've ever truly had. It means that every bruise you left on her skin, every lie you told about her name, every night you made her feel like she was nothing, is a debt that is now mine to collect." Theron's face had gone white. "You will regret choosing her," Theron said, but his voice had lost its thunder. It came out thin, reedy, the voice of a man who had just realized he was standing in the wrong room. No, Julius's smile vanished. What replaced it was something primal, something that belonged to the wolf beneath the crown. I will spend every day of my life grateful that she chose me, that after everything you did to her, she was still brave enough, still strong enough, to let someone in. And that someone was me. He turned to his guard captain. Lord Vial is stripped of his council seat, effective immediately. His lands in the Western Province are to be audited for the abuses I now have cause to investigate. He will be escorted from this palace and informed that should he come within 100 leagues of my queen, the consequences will not be political. He paused. They will be personal. The guard moved. Theron sputtered, raged, shouted things that echoed off the walls as he was dragged backward. The jeweled woman fled before him. The throne room buzzed like a disturbed hive. But Gabriella didn't hear any of it, because Julius had turned back to her, and the predator was gone. In his place was just a man, her man, crossing the distance between them with eyes that had gone soft and worried. Gabriella. He said her name like a question, like a prayer, like he needed to hear her say she was okay more than he needed his next breath. She was shaking. She could feel it in her hands, in her knees, in the place behind her ribs where she'd hidden every terrible thing Theron had ever made her feel. It was all rising now, all of it, and she couldn't stop it. "I'm here," she whispered. He reached her. His hands found her face, tilting it up, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't known were falling. "You're safe. He's gone. He's never coming back." "I know." Her voice broke. "I know he's not." She pressed her face into his chest and let herself fall apart, and he held her together. Right there, in front of 600 witnesses, the Alpha King of the Eastern Dominion wrapped his arms around his queen and held her while she cried, and he didn't care who saw. He pressed his lips to her hair and murmured words she couldn't quite catch, soft and fierce and certain, and the bond between them hummed like a living thing, warm and golden and unbreakable. Later, when the throne room had emptied and the servants had dimmed the lamps and the night had settled over the palace like a velvet curtain, they sat together on the floor of their private chambers. Not the bed, not the chairs by the fire. The floor, because Gabriella had slid down the wall when her legs finally gave out, and Julius had simply folded himself down beside her. "He was wrong," she said, her head on his shoulder, "about everything. But hearing it again, I know. I spent so long believing him, believing I was nothing, that no one would ever—" She stopped, drew a breath. "And then you walked into my shop bleeding all over my floor." He laughed, low and quiet, vibrating through his chest and into hers. "Not my finest entrance. It was perfect." She lifted her head and looked at him. Really looked. At the scar through his eyebrow, at the amber eyes that held her like she was something precious, at the mouth that had just dismantled her worst nightmare with nothing but words. "You didn't even hesitate. In front of everyone. You didn't hesitate." "Why would I?" He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. Defending you isn't courage, it's instinct." She kissed him then, slow and soft and deep, and the bond between them blazed golden in the quiet dark. 2 months later, Gabriella stood in the palace garden with dirt under her fingernails and sunlight on her face, examining a row of moon-petal seedlings she'd planted that morning. The garden had been Julius's idea. He'd given her an entire wing of the palace grounds, told her to build whatever she wanted, and then had looked so ridiculously pleased when she'd chosen to create a medicinal garden that she'd laughed until her sides ached. She'd also established a free clinic in the lower city, staffed with healers she'd trained herself. The first patients had come tentatively, disbelieving that the queen would really stand behind a work table and mix poultices with her own hands. They came in droves now, footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. The bond told her, warm and steady. like a second heartbeat. He stopped just behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, and his hand settled on her waist. "You have dirt on your face," he murmured against her ear. "You have a council meeting in 10 minutes. They can wait." She turned in his arms. He looked good in the sunlight. The crown he'd reluctantly worn to the morning's audiences now absent, his hair slightly disheveled from where he'd run his hands through it. He always did that when the council frustrated him. "How did it go?" she asked. "The Western Province audit is complete. 14 counts of abuse of authority. Theron's family holdings have been redistributed to the communities he exploited." Something dark crossed his face, then cleared. "It's done." She nodded. It was done. Not just the legal reckoning, but the internal one. The part of her that had carried Theron's voice like a stone in her chest had grown quieter over the past weeks. Not silent. Maybe never completely silent, but quiet enough that she could hear other things over it. Things like laughter. Things like her own name spoken with love. "I'm proud of you," Julius said, and she blinked. "For what?" "For being here. For building this." He gestured at the garden, at the palace, at the life unfurling around them. "For choosing to stay when everything in you had learned to run." Her throat tightened. "You made it easy." "No, I didn't." He smiled, the real one, the one that softened every hard line of his face and turned the Alpha King into just a Julius. "I made it worth it. There's a difference. The bravery was all yours." She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. He responded immediately, deepening the kiss, one hand sliding up her back to cradle the base of her skull, and the bond between them sang in a frequency that felt like sunlight and safety and home. When she pulled back, she was smiling, the kind of smile she'd forgotten she was capable of. Wide and unguarded and free. "Come on," she said, taking his hand. "You'll be late." "I'm the king. I'm never late. Everyone else is simply early." She laughed, and the sound of it carried across the garden, bright and clear, and the moon petal seedlings swayed in the breeze as if they were listening, as if even the flowers knew that something broken had been mended, something lost had been found, and something that was always meant to be had finally, beautifully begun.